You are listening to the Indie Film Hustle Podcast Network. For more great filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, head over to ifhpodcastnetwork.com. Today's show is sponsored by Rise of the Filmtrepreneur, how to turn your independent film into a profitable business. It's harder today than ever before for independent filmmakers to make money with their films. From predatory film distributors ripping them off to huckster film aggregators who prey upon them, the odds are stacked against the indie filmmaker. In Rise of the Filmtrepreneur, I break down how to actually make money with your film projects and show you how to turn your indie film into a profitable business. With case studies examining successes and failures, this book shows you the step-by-step method to turn your passion into a profitable career. The book is available in paperback, ebook, and of course, audiobook. If you want to order it, just head over to www.filmbizbook.com. That's filmbizbook.com.
All right, guys, grab your coffee. Today we're talking about legal issues. Yay! Today we're talking to entertainment attorney Mark Litwak about all the things you need to do on a legal side to protect yourself while you're making your movie. So this is really important to know, guys. So please listen to this. Even though I know it's legal stuff, it's really important.
Welcome to the Indie Film Academy podcast, where it's all about learning how to make and market your independent film online. And now your host, Jason Buff.
Hey guys, it's Jason Buff here with the Indie Film Academy podcast. Today we're going to be talking with Mark Litwak about the legal aspects of making a film and things like contracts and protecting yourself, making sure that you have basically that you own your film. I mean, it's a fairly it's something that a lot of people don't talk about, but when you go to somebody to try and, sell your film, how do you establish that you actually own the film? What are the papers? What are the, what's the chain of ownership? Do you own the screenplay, or do you have the right to use the screenplay? Do you have the right to put these actors in your film? Are there going to be legal issues with music? Are there going to be issues with the work that people have put into the film? So these are all things that you have to consider when you're dealing with the legal side of your film. And there's ways to do it without going broke, but you don't want to get to the end of the process. And some of the other people we've talked to have also mentioned this, that a lot of films go to film festivals or film markets and places like that, and they try to sell their film, and they can't actually sell their film because they don't have the right documents. So you just want to make sure that you have a lawyer helping you out through the process. As always, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast, and check us out at indiefilmacademy.com. Sign up for our newsletter and we'll send you a free ebook. Indie Film Academy is sponsored by printdirtcheap.com. Printdirtcheap.com offers extremely high quality at a very, very low price. They can do anything from CD inserts, cards, posters, banners, catalogs, and calendars. And if you use the code IFA podcast, they will give you 20% off. So check that out. Now let's go to the interview.
In general, on a film, when is the part of the process that if you were in a perfect world, that you would be brought into a film project?
If money is not an issue, you should probably retain an attorney early on. But for independent filmmakers, money is often an issue. And I guess you need to bring in an attorney depending upon when there are legal issues that you need assistance on that will determine which path to take and how to proceed. I just received a call this morning from a writer who's planning to write a script. Hasn't even written the script, but he had questions about what he could do or not do because the script involved depicting real people who at one point were alive, and he needed to know, what was he allowed to do under the law without getting sued. There are other instances where you have a script that's entirely fictional and it's entirely original. In other words, it's not based upon anyone else's work, where perhaps you don't need to get advice that early on before you start writing the script, but only when you get to the point where you're going to actually produce the material might you need some help.
Okay. And are there any common mistakes that you find with producers when they're just starting the process?
Well, I think one common mistake is a lot of times producers, they just use contracts, to make their movie that they got from some other shoot or some other place or off the internet, and they may or may not be appropriate. And what happens is, after the movie is completed, assuming they make a really good movie, because if they make a terrible movie and it's only going to be exhibited in their home to their friends and family, it doesn't much matter if they didn't have the paperwork in order. But assuming they make a good movie and distributors are interested in it and film festivals want to show it, at some point they're going to probably have to buy E&O insurance. They're not going to get a film distributed, exhibited in the United States, even on just home video, without having that insurance. And I think most filmmakers are kind of surprised when they see the application form, how long and detailed it is and all the questions that are being asked, because the insurance companies basically would like your premium dollar, but don't particularly want to take any more risk than they have to. So what happens is, if they just borrowed some contracts from another shoot, they may or may not, be appropriate. And if they're not appropriate, then someone has to fix them. And sometimes that's a problem, because sometimes you can't go back, you can't find some of your actors and to get them to re-execute, a better version of the contract that they signed. So if you can't find those people, you might have a very good film, but for insurance purposes, no distributor will touch it.
Now, is it okay in certain circumstances where they don't have a big budget for the filmmakers or the producers to come to you when you just look at the documents I've already created and make sure that they'll work?
Well, we can do that, but that doesn't necessarily save any time or legal bills, because if you give me a badly drafted contract and I have to spend 2 hours fixing it and rewriting it, to make it good, it would be a lot simpler if I just used one of the templates on my computer. I have thousands of them that was pretty close, 95% of the way there, and just, picked the right template and filled in the information. It would be much faster and more efficient and would cost the filmmaker a lot less. So filling it out is not necessarily a tremendous help if it's the wrong form to begin with. I mean, when you hire a lawyer, what you're doing is you're hiring someone with some expertise to figure out what you need, and what you need is not the same in all scenarios. What you need, depends upon the circumstances of your shoot, whether it's an original script or whether it's based on some other work, whether you wrote the script, whether you have to acquire rights from another writer, depends upon who directed it. A lot depends upon whether it's union or non-union. And, so you need someone who can understand, what is the appropriate circumstances and what is the appropriate document. If you just blindly just take another contract, it may or may not be appropriate. It's sort of like, you're feeling ill and you want to save the expense of going to a doctor. So that the last time you were sick, you went to the pharmacy and you got a blue pill. So this time you figure, well, we just skip going to the doctor and go to the pharmacy and get a blue pill. Well, it's possible you get the right pill for your ailment, but since the doctor hasn't seen you, you may very well get a pill, assuming you could get a pill from a pharmacy without a prescription, that's completely inappropriate to whatever ails you. So it's the same thing, with legal documents. There's not just one type of legal document. For instance, when you're hiring actors, it could be a direct employment, or it could be what's called a loan-out deal, where you hire them through their company. It could be a union deal, or it could be a non-union deal. And there's lots of variations, in hiring them as to, what the deal terms are. And so the contract, has to be adjusted.
So you can't, for example, just do a generic release form with your actors, and even if they're not like SAG or whatever, you would have to have something very specific to their situation.
Well, when you say generic, meaning, there's, first of all, if you're hiring actors as compared to subjects in a documentary, they're not exactly the same thing. When you hire actors, it's a little bit different than if you interview someone for your documentary film. So one, I would call a subject for the documentary. The other is an actor. When you hire an actor to be in your movie, you don't need just a release. You need what's called a work for hire agreement. It has to have a paragraph in it that says that their contribution to your film, their performance, is going to be owned by you as their employer. And if you don't do that, then you don't own the complete copyright in your film. And imagine spending all this time and effort making the movie and then finding out, you don't really own it all. So you need to have the correct form. When you hire an actor, it's usually as an employee, not as an independent contractor. Having them sign a release is not usually, sufficient. And if the actor is a minor, there's other concerns that need to be addressed. And there may be other issues as well.
And what would you consider the most important documents for establishing the chain of ownership? That's what it's referred to, right? The chain or the
chain of title.
Chain of title.
Well, the most important document is probably a document that's critical that you can't fill out yourself. I mean, a lot of times filmmakers wear different hats. And if you're the filmmaker and you're the producer and you're also the director and you're also the writer, I would not be too concerned about having an employment contract between your LLC or your corporation and yourself, because you could always get that later. You're not going to disappear. But if you're hiring an actor or a cinematographer and you don't get around to doing the paperwork until 8 months after the film wraps, and you can't find these people, you have a serious problem. So, so the answer is it depends upon the circumstances. For filmmakers who write their own script and they're directing their own movie, their own personal contracts may be eventually needed, especially if the movie is going to be owned by an entity other than themselves, like an LLC or a corporation. But, it's not that urgent. On the other hand, if you're a filmmaker, but you're really in the producer role and you're hiring a director, you better have a contract with that person, and it should really be in place before they begin work on directing your movie.
Okay, now you mentioned an LLC. Is it absolutely important for every film to become an LLC? No,
it doesn't need. You don't always need to become an LLC or incorporate, but there's certain advantages. The advantages are basically two. One is there's limited liability. If you set up your business of making the movie in the form of an LLC or corporation, in the eyes of the law, they're seen as a separate legal entity from you personally. And so if the entity that's making the movie, let's say it's an LLC, signs a contract for equipment and eventually there's some sort of a contract dispute and a lawsuit, you're not personally liable. And your home and your car and your personal assets wouldn't be liable unless you signed a guarantee for the contract. Just your company would be liable. So liability is one issue, and the other issue is taxes. Sometimes incorporating or setting up an LLC can save you some money on taxes. On the other hand, there's also an expense in setting up an LLC, and the entity is probably also subject to taxes. So the answer is it depends upon the circumstances. But certainly there's filmmakers who've made movies in their own name, or they filed what's called a DBA, a fictitious business statement. It's John Smith, DBA Serendipity Productions, because they just want a fancy name for their company, but it's not actually a separate entity. It's just sort of an alias. It doesn't give you any protection from liability, but it does give you something nice to put on your letterhead other than your name.
Right. Do you need a LLC for things like fundraising and for having investors and things like that? It
depends. I would say most of the time when you have outside investors, in other words, it's not coming out of your own pocket, usually an LLC is used because an LLC is a very flexible vehicle. It allows you to have investors who can put in different amounts of money and have different interests, different shares of profits. So nowadays, most of the time, we set it up as an LLC. Your investors, may not want to write you a check and not also own a piece of the company that's going to own the film. They can't really own you because slavery is no longer allowed. but if you set up an LLC, they could be a part owner of the LLC, and that might make a difference in whether they're willing to, write you a check, especially if it's a big check.
Okay. Now, when you work with a film and their financing, are you involved with like different ways that they're raising money, or just the legal aspects of it?
Well, we're we're involved in the legal work to enable them to raise money and maybe negotiating with other parties, but we're not fundraisers. We don't go out and beat the bushes to find the money.
So what would you say are the most typical ways you see of independent films raising money? Is it primarily from donors, or is it things like sponsorships and I would say it's friends and family, and more recently people have had luck with Kickstarter campaigns. Okay. I mean, I think a lot depends upon the budget of the film and the filmmaker and what kind of relationships they have. The easiest way to, finance a film is to be rich and just, finance it out of your own pocket. That's very simple, especially from a legal point of view. But in many instances, that's not possible. I would say a lot of filmmakers get their start with financial help from friends and family, and those are people that are highly, supportive because they believe in you and want to support you. And the other group of people that tend to invest in movies are professionals, doctors, dentists, lawyers, people who make a very good living. And this year, instead of going to Las Vegas and spending $10,000 gambling in the casinos, they're going to give the $10,000 to this young filmmaker who has lots of enthusiasm, and they think it'll be fun and exciting, and they want to invite their friends to the screening of their movie. It's certainly not going to be any less risky than going to Las Vegas, that's for sure. Have you ever dealt with these new iPad release forms at all?
iPad release forms?
Yeah. There's like a lot of apps out now that are supposedly like release forms for actors and things. I didn't know if you had seen any of those.
I haven't seen that. Obviously, on a laptop computer or an iPad, you can look at documents, but you need to have the person sign the document, and so at some point, usually you need to put it on paper so they can sign it.
Well, they even have like the little area you can sign like on the surface, but I don't know if there have been any legal issues with that. But it's kind of an interesting. Well,
it's really not that expensive to print out, most of these contracts.
That's true.
In my opinion, you don't really want to be the test case about whether someone, signing your iPad, with their finger, whether that's legally binding. I would just print it out and have them sign it. It's not that big a deal.
Right. Now I wanted to ask you a quick question about music in film. And there's a lot of copyright-free music that's online that's, some of it is older orchestras and old pieces of music that also the recording is also not copyrighted or whatever. Is there any kind of like danger with using music, or do you see any filmmakers having problems with, putting music that they've found online that's supposedly copyright-free and it turns out it's not?
Yeah, anyone can set up a website and license music, which they may or may not own. And, I'd be very wary about buying music just from some website, because if it turns out that the person who sold you the music doesn't have the rights to the music, guess what? You get nothing. It's like if you go downstairs and walk outside your office building and someone offers you a brand new red Maserati for $10 and you buy it, and, do you think you get good title to that car? You don't. It's the parking valet who sold it to you for $10, and you don't own it. And it's the same thing with music or scripts or anything. If the person who ostensibly is selling it to you doesn't actually own the rights, you don't get the rights. Okay, so you have to be careful about the source of music. The easiest, least expensive way to put music on your soundtrack is to hire a really talented person who sits in a room with a synthesizer, and they create the music, they record the music, they perform the music. And nowadays with the technology, sometimes you can get a very high quality sounding soundtrack from that person, and it's one contract, and it's a good deal.
Right.
If you have to start licensing the music, for most independent filmmakers, they're not going to spend $50,000 to license a Bruce Springsteen song. It's just too much for their type of budget. Right. If you want to use public domain music, you have to understand that there's a difference between the composition in the public domain and the recording being in the public domain. A lot of great music is available the composition is available for free because, Beethoven, all of his music is now in the public domain because it was made a long time ago. And there's lots of music like that out there. But even though the composition is in the public domain, it doesn't mean the particular recording is going to be in the public domain. If you want to use a Beethoven's Fifth Symphony on your soundtrack, the composition's in the public domain. But if you go into a record store, assuming you can find a record store nowadays, and you buy a recording by the Boston Symphony Pops of Beethoven's Fifth, that particular recording may still be under copyright, even though the composition is not. So you could take a public domain song, and you could hire your own musicians and create your own recording, and that way you might get some pretty classy sounding music for not a lot of money. Or you could look for a recording that's also in the public domain, but that usually means it's more than 70 years old. And audio technology being what it is, most recordings that are more than 70 years old are pretty scratchy and don't really sound all that great.
Another issue that I run up against a lot is the of shooting in public streets and trying to shoot films in places where they're not necessarily given the rights to shoot there. They don't have any sort of documentation. Is that something that can be a problem? Like, say, for example, you want to shoot in a public street somewhere, and even if you kind of get people that are visible on camera, can you run into problems if you don't get the what's the word I'm looking for? The permit. Yeah, sorry, the permit to shoot in, like, say, for example, like a park or something.
Well, there's different issues.
Okay.
The permit is between you and the county or the local government, and if they have permitting requirements. And certainly, if your crew is substantial and you're going to pull up with a truck and lights and people, you probably don't want to risk, some police officer coming up to you and saying, "Where's your permit?" not having one, and then kicking you out of there. But sometimes nowadays, the crew is just 2 or 3 people, and they frankly don't look much different than a bunch of tourists, with their cameras, and they can sometimes, shoot in public places without, raising any notice, and avoid, being confronted with a lack of a permit. And I've certainly heard instances of young filmmakers just buying a bunch of T-shirts from UCLA and having their crew wear them. And if they get asked about it, they just say it's a student film. And even though there's really no legal reason why student films should be treated differently than any other films, for some reason, apparently, when the police you tell them it's a student film, maybe they won't bother. The other issue is capturing other people on camera who aren't your actors, who you don't have any kind of release with. I would say if it's a dramatic film, and you have actors on camera who are identifiable, in other words, not just a speck in the crowd in the background, you should get a release from them. If it's a documentary, it's not always required. When 60 Minutes goes out and does a expose of the bad guys and has a camera, and they knock on your door and they want to ask you questions, they're not getting a release from that person who doesn't want to be interviewed. And they're chasing them through the parking lot or down the courthouse steps. They're not getting a release. And so, generally speaking, you can film people out in public view, but you can't necessarily film them in the bathroom, in the hotel room, in an area where they have an expectation of privacy.
And that's, say, for example, you're walking down a public street, and even like a parade or something, like a 4th of July parade or something, and you have 2 actors walking down the street. Can you run into trouble if, like, there's somebody in the background there that, maybe sees that? I mean, is that something that would happen? That they would sue and say, "Oh, I didn't want to be in the background of this picture"?
Well, yeah, it could be a problem. I mean, you could also, blur their faces. You could shoot it from a perspective where, you can't really identify who they are. I mean, sometimes you see footage of people, all you see is their feet or their backs, and you can't really identify them. And it's going to be very hard for them to make a case that this is them because, lots of people wear the same type of sneakers and, their feet are just not that distinctive where people would know who it is. So, it really, depends upon the circumstances. But, if it's not a documentary, if it's a narrative film where you have actors, the better practice is always to get releases from anyone who someone watching the movie would be able to identify them.
Right. And is that the same in terms of, let's say you go to a national monument, or like some private place where there's some very well-known structure that's like in a private area, would that need to be like signed off? Could they retroactively sue and say, "Oh, you weren't supposed to film in this place"?
Well, you mean like a public place, like the FBI building or Mount Rushmore?
Well, for example, we were going to shoot some things in Yucatan in Mexico, and there was a scene that was going to be filmed in some of the Mayan ruins that are in a private park. And we weren't sure whether there were going to be legal problems with that retroactive. I mean, we were going to shoot without asking for the permits, just a really small scene. And I didn't know, I was always worried about it because I didn't know if that was going to cause a problem later.
Well, if you're abroad in a foreign country, I think it's going to be very difficult if someone in a foreign country wants to sue you, because they're probably going to have to come to the United States to sue you. And I don't see that, easily, happening. It's not an easy question to answer because it depends upon the circumstances. Right. Buildings and architecture is subject of copyright, but there's an exception. Copyright for architecture is a little bit different than other copyrights, in that if you capture a building from a public place, like from a public street, you don't it's not an infringement of the copyright owner of the architecture of the building. Okay. So it's a little bit different. Generally speaking, if you're shooting out in public streets, other than the permit requirements, especially if you're obstructing traffic, you definitely want to get a permit from the local authorities, and you're going to need to have the police there to help control the crowds and whatever. Right. But if you're just like shooting a documentary, I mean, news crews go out all the time and they shoot the news, they shoot fires, they don't get releases. Mm-hmm. Well,
I guess the idea that I'm trying to understand is that most of this is geared towards trying to secure your E&O insurance, right? I mean, that's the main thing you want to be covered for with all of these different things, right?
Right.
Okay.
The answer to your question is, if a major studio is doing it, they're going to want everything totally wrapped up, signed, permits for everything, location releases for everything. For independent films, a lot of independent filmmakers are not as worried about being sued. First of all, because most independent filmmakers are just not that good a wealthy target for someone to file a lawsuit. I mean, who in their right mind is going to sue some independent filmmaker, living out of a rent-controlled apartment who doesn't have any money? I mean, you have to be pretty stupid to do that, because even if you win, you're not going to be able to collect. But, if the defendant is Paramount Pictures, if you win, you're going to be able to collect because they have lots of assets.
Now, I wanted to change gears for a second and talk about the AFM and film markets and distribution. Now, what are currently the biggest markets, like the biggest events for selling films? I know there's Berlin and Cannes and AFM. Is there any more? Well, those are the big three, I would say. Okay.
Berlin, AFM, and Cannes. And then there's also MIP and MIP TV that are in Cannes, France, and something called NatB, which I think the next one is in Miami. Okay. And it's often in the United States. I mean, those are the big film and TV markets, and there's some overlap. A lot of the buyers are the same in all of them.
Okay. Now, I've never been to the AFM, but my impression is it's kind of chaotic.
Well, you could call it chaotic. You could call it vibrant. I mean, if it's a marketplace and there's buyers and sellers of films coming together, I mean, I think it's probably less chaotic than being at the stock exchange, where people are selling commodities and yelling and screaming at each other. It's a little bit more calmer than that. But yeah, there's a lot of activity going on. I mean, you have people from all over the world flying into AFM, and they have to license a couple hundred films in the period of, maybe a week or less. And so they're running around, looking at a lot of stuff, watching trailers on screens and suites of the various distributors, going to actual theaters nearby to watch movies. And there's a lot of activity, but it's not necessarily a bad thing.
What is the process for a filmmaker who wants to sell their film at the AFM? Do they need to get special, like a booth? I mean, I really have no knowledge of how it all works there.
They could conceivably rent a booth, but it's expensive, and frankly, they don't filmmakers don't know anything about buying and selling films internationally. They don't know who the buyers in Turkey are. They don't know what a reasonable price for the film in Turkey is. They don't know how to make delivery to Turkey, and they basically don't want to be in that business anyway. They want to be off making their next film. So most filmmakers will retain a sales agent, a foreign sales agent, or international sales agent is what they're called. And these are people who specialize in licensing films throughout the world, and they have relationships all over the world. And when they rent a booth at AFM, they're not selling one film; they're selling, a bunch of films. So the cost of attending AFM is amortized over those films, and that's what they do. They know how to sell films, and also they handle delivery, because when the guy from Turkey licenses your film, he not only needs a copy of your film. He needs to sign, a contract, obviously. He needs to remit payment, but he's also going to want copies of your artwork, your key art. He's going to want copies of still photos. He has to create a local campaign in Turkey to sell your film. And there's a whole bunch of different delivery items that you have to give them, including a script that they can use to either dub or subtitle your film in another language. So the sales agents, if they're honest and they're not overcharging you or deducting a whole bunch of illegitimate expenses, provides a very valuable function for the filmmaker, because they have the expertise in that area, and most filmmakers don't. They don't know how to sell their film, and even if they rented a booth in AFM, it's not clear that buyers would come to their booth, because there's 200 other booths there with people who've been in the business many years, and a lot of the buyers have a certain amount of comfort buying from companies that they've had relationships with over the years. They buy a film from an independent filmmaker they don't know from Adam, and the filmmaker doesn't deliver the film, because the buyers usually wire 100% of the money before they get the film. They don't get the film, they have no remedy. On the other hand, they buy it from a sales agent who they have a relationship with, and that sales agent values the relationship and is going to make sure that if there's a technical problem with the film they deliver, that it'll be fixed, or they'll substitute another film for it.
So do you think that filmmakers should already have a relationship with the sales agents before they arrive?
Well, look, you can go to AFM, especially the last few days when things have quieted down a bit, and you can go there to meet sales agents for the next market. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. I always encourage my clients to meet with the sales agents in person, either at their offices or at a market. But if you're going to a market, and you're not experienced in the business, and you're going to either rent a booth or try to sell the film out of your suitcase walking along the halls, you're not going to likely to have much success. And that's not a good idea. And so if you're going to get a foreign sales agent, you should get one at least 2 months before the market, because you need to let the foreign sales agent prepare for the market. They need to reserve screening rooms. They need to include you in their trade ads. They need to alert their buyers of the upcoming films. They need to do a whole bunch of preparation work. And if you just sign up with them at the last moment, you're really doing yourself a big disservice. And the first market that your film is sold in is by far the most important market, because at the second market, the buyers see your film and say, "Oh, I remember that from the last market. Oh, it still hasn't sold in Bulgaria. Well, I guess it's not such a hot item, is it?" And the price they're willing to pay goes down.
You had mentioned that the sales for the U.S. are much more difficult than selling to the international market. What are the major international markets right now for films?
Well, China has come up tremendously. Japan, South Korea, France, Italy, Spain, the UK, Germany. Those are the countries that are the major markets in the sense that they write the bigger checks. If you sell your film to Albania, it's nice, but you're not going to get a very big check from Albania, because it's a very small country, and that's it. But there's a lot of countries that buy American films, and if you sell to 50, 60, even small countries, it adds up after a while.
Now, can you describe the process when let's say someone wants to buy your film? Do you need to have things there ready for them? I mean, documents and everything. Does everything happen at the AFM, or is it just you say, okay, we agree to do this, and then we'll talk about it later, or we'll figure everything out later?
No, you mean between the sales agent and the buyer?
Yeah.
Well, often the parties will sign a short form deal memo,
Okay.
like a 2-page deal memo summarizing the deal terms. And sometimes, if it's a big territory, and a lot of money is going to take place, they may want a DVD to take it back to the home office and get other people to see it before they make this commitment. The short form, couple-page contract is usually followed up with a long-form agreement that's usually done, a number of months after the market is over. And then the seller, the sales agent on behalf of the filmmaker, sends a notice of tentative delivery to the buyer saying, we're ready to deliver the film, and now you need to send us the rest of the money. Often the buyers will make a deposit of 20% of the license fee up front to basically buy the film or reserve the film and sign the deal memo, and the other 80% they have to wire before they get the film.
Okay, and are the legal aspects different for every country that you're working with? Do you have to, I assume they're doing different contracts in each of the,
No.
say you're
No, they're not. And
Okay.
the vast majority of people use the IFTA forms, the organization IFTA that runs AFM. They have model forms, which actually anyone can buy from IFTA. And those are the forms that are used. And some sales agents do a slight variation of it, but the forms are familiar to the buyers and the sellers, and they're comfortable with them. And they're all in English. And even though they're detailed, people in the business understand them. If you have a whole bunch of different contracts in different languages, it would really be unworkable. So they're all in English, and they're somewhat standardized.
What are the majority of the deals that you see? Are they primarily for DVD releases, or are any of them theatrical, or does it just depend?
Well, the foreign buyer, the buyer from Switzerland who buys your film, they're usually buying all rights in Switzerland. They may not necessarily exploit all rights in Switzerland, and they may not exploit all the rights themselves. The buyer in Switzerland could be someone who owns a group of theaters in Switzerland, and they're primarily interested in the theatrical rights, and then they're going to try to turn around and license the TV rights to a local TV station and make a deal with a local home video company. Or the buyer from Switzerland could be a home video company, and they're going to buy all the rights, and they may or may not release it theatrically, and they may license it to TV. A lot of times the buyers don't directly themselves exploit all the rights, but they want to secure all the rights, and then they may sublicense some of them to other parties in their territory.
Okay, and now in the U.S., what do you find that people are primarily focused on foreign markets now because it's so much harder to sell in the U.S.?
Well, I don't know about focused. I would say most independent filmmakers would really like their film to be shown in a theater near them and where their mother and father can come and see it with a crowd giving them a standing ovation. But so that's what they're often focused on. Whether they can achieve that or not depends. The U.S. market is extremely competitive. There's lots of films competing for theaters. A lot of independent filmmakers nowadays, can't get a theatrical release unless they're willing to pay for it. But there are new ways of licensing films. There's been a lot of activity recently with filmmakers licensing films to Netflix and some new buyers and Amazon and whatever who in the past haven't been licensees of films. So if you have a really good film, you can get it out there. It may not be on a 2,000 screen release across the United States because most independent films are just not going to get that kind of release, behind them. But, it's not at all unusual to have a film, shown in a handful or maybe even a few hundred theaters and then generate revenue through VOD and home video and all the other ways of exploiting films.
I assume that most people want to do theatrical just more for prestige at this point.
Well, the theatrical release is good for one's ego, and but it's also good because a lot of the foreign buyers, if a film has had a significant theatrical release in the United States, they view it differently and are willing to pay more for it than if it's a film that's direct to video or direct to TV. So what the theatrical release does, the theatrical release is often not necessarily profitable in its own right because it's so expensive. But what the theatrical release does is it builds awareness for the film. And so a lot of times when people, order a film, over the internet on TV or Hulu or whatever. It's often a film they heard about when it was in theaters, but they didn't get around to seeing it. So even though the theatrical release may not be profitable in its own right, it does build awareness for the film, and that increases the license fees you're going to get from home video and television.
If that's the case, would it be important for people to try to have a theatrical release before they come to the American film market so that they could sell it with that prestige, or is that possible?
It depends on the film. I would say if you have a film that really is going to not be something that people are going to pay to go to see in a theater, then going to a theatrical release, I'm not sure it gets you very far. It probably just wastes some money and wastes some time. But for some films, it's very important if it's a festival type film to get it into top festivals. And in a sense, that's somewhat of a substitute for being in theaters. But if it's successful in some of the top film festivals, it wins award at Sundance, it probably will get into theaters also after that. So it really depends a lot on the type of film you have. If you have a film that really the economics are against you for showing it theatrically and generating any revenue, you don't accomplish a great deal showing it in a bunch of theaters to an empty house. But in some instances, having the film shown in theaters can be very good. But it's very difficult nowadays to secure theaters on a traditional revenue sharing basis with the theater owner, because you're competing against Paramount and Fox and Sony, who have these big blockbuster movies. And the average theater owner, they'd rather show Spider-Man 6 than your little film, because they're going to make a lot more money on Spider-Man 6, not to mention the fact that they make a lot of money at the candy stand. And so even if they're only getting a relatively small portion of the ticket price, because most of it's going back to the studio, they're selling a lot of popcorn and candy. And that's where they keep 100% of that revenue.
When you're talking about foreign sales, one of the things you had mentioned before was that you can make a lot of money in certain, countries like, say, Spain or Germany. Do you find that many independent films that are under $1 million are able to just make back all their funding by selling a good product to those foreign markets?
I would say no. I would say most independent films don't make back their money.
Okay.
Because the market is very tough, and I would say more often than not, investors don't recoup their investment. On the other hand, if you make a really good film and it gets out there and it gets some great reviews and it shows that you can really have the talent to make a movie, even if the movie isn't profitable, it can be a tremendous boost to your career. And now all of a sudden you're getting offered, other films to direct and being paid quite handsomely for it. So, the film business is extremely risky and very difficult to make money in. But every year a few films come out of nowhere and do extremely well, because the audience really cares mostly about the story and not necessarily where it comes from.
What are what would you consider the most important resources for filmmakers if they wanted to learn about what was going on in foreign sale? I mean, are there any online publications? Where can they really kind of educate themselves about what people are buying and distributors are looking for? Is there any sort of central area?
Well, you can read the trade papers. That's for sure. I actually written a book called Risky Business: Financing and Distributing Independent Films, which talks about the industry and these deals and the legalities of it and how this all works. The prices that are paid vary over time, and probably only the sales agents who are in the front line of selling are going to know that Germany is a little bit down or a little bit up compared to the last market. I mean, that's not going to be information that's readily available because it changes constantly.
Now, is there a role of like aggregators at the AFM? I mean, are sales agents dealing with aggregators or?
Well, some sales agents have aggregators is usually a term that is used for distributors, often home video distributors in the United States that will put out a film on home video, but also nowadays will license it to iTunes and Netflix and all those other forms. And the reason that aggregators are important is that Netflix doesn't want to negotiate with individual filmmakers for one film. They'd rather negotiate with a home video company that has a library of 500 films, make a deal and get the whole library. I mean, the transactional cost, the legal cost of negotiating a contract for an individual film, don't make a lot of sense to them. So most independent filmmakers have a hard time selling their films themselves directly to Netflix, even if it's for a very good price, because Netflix, really wants to buy films by the bushel load, not individuals. So aggregators are nowadays, a lot of them are home video companies that not only will put out the film on DVDs, but also put it out on a VOD and SVOD and all the other new ways that people are watching movies.
Do you find that's kind of the last resort for films at all? Like going to Netflix if they haven't gotten a distribution deal somewhere else?
Well, I don't think it's a last resort. I mean, we've had clients who have made huge amounts of money from Netflix. I mean,
oh really?
Oh yeah. I mean, huge amounts of money. It's amazing. Netflix, and there's a company called Redbox that basically has these vending machines all over the country that have, also generate, a fair amount of revenue. A lot of the home video stores are gone. They're not even, Blockbuster is gone. So everything is changing, and there's new ways of distributing films, and in some ways it's a very exciting time, and there's a lot of activity going on, these are becoming the primary sources. Home video revenue for packaged media, which means like DVDs and Blu-rays, has actually gone down in the past few years. And more people are getting their programming, over the internet or by satellite or various forms of VOD. And that seems to be the trend.
Well, my impression has always been that Netflix just didn't pay filmmakers very much. But maybe I guess that's wrong then.
That's totally wrong. I have filmmakers I have a filmmaker who made a documentary film who's gotten huge six-figure checks, and then they renewed and paid another huge amount of money.
Oh, that's right.
That's absolutely wrong. I mean, it depends upon the film. If the film is good, they have a lot of money. They're buying a lot of stuff. Amazon, Hulu, there's a whole bunch of Yahoo, they're all out there, trying to, build up their libraries of material.
When you talk about the aggregators, are those who's setting the price for the films? Is it the deal between the filmmaker and the aggregator, or is it related? I mean, how does that work?
Well, it's a negotiation.
Right.
I mean, the aggregator, let's say it's a home video company that's also licensing product to Netflix. They're going to try to get as big a license fee as they can. And Netflix is probably going to want to, pay as little as it can get away with. But there's competition. And, there's a lot of people, for a desirable film, there's a lot of people who want it.
And is that something that's coming directly out of AFM?
AFM is a venue to show the film. I mean, some films get noticed at AFM. Some films get noticed at Sundance. Some films get noticed at South by Southwest. Okay. Some films, the filmmaker rents the theater and shows it and, gets noticed that way. It's hard to... There's not one path. Right.
Okay. Well, great. I really appreciate the I have a million different questions, but I know you don't have that much time. So I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Good luck.
Well, thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye.
I want to thank Mark Litwak for coming on today. And I really think that he's given us a lot of great information, especially to those of us who wince a little when whenever you start talking about legal issues and things like that. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review. And of course, check us out, indiefilmacademy.com. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Indie Film Academy podcast. Don't forget to join our newsletter for more tips and tricks on how to make and market your film online. Go to www.indiefilmacademy.com.